Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and accomplished professional from Pittsburgh, USA, Mr. Michael Couch. Michael, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Ash.
Michael is the president of Michael Couch and Associates Incorporated. And as I mentioned, he's in Pittsburgh, USA. So, Michael, before we start talking about culture, tell me a little bit about your own journey.
Yeah, well, it's like your journey. It's been not been a straight line. I started off with a background in industrial and organizational psychology. I worked in, talent management kind of roles for many years, but then ended up moving out of that and ran operations for a small manufacturer, and then started that business to help start up a business unit. Our goal was to polish up that business and sell it, and we did, and that gave me an opportunity. Oh, geez, what was it now? 16 years ago to start my own practice. As you said, it's a very creatively called Michael Couch and Associates, and we really focus in on the topic we'll touch on today around organizational culture, but also strategy-driven leadership and leadership development.
Wonderful. So let's talk culture then. And my first question is, Drucker is believed to have said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I'd love to get your perspective.
Yes, and Peter Drucker is, like you said, so supposed to have said that many years ago when there really wasn't that much evidence. He was going by his own personal observations. Well, now we know, after some great research over the years, that yes, culture comes first. Culture is a leading indicator of almost every factor of organization performance. So yes, culture would eat strategy for breakfast. So if you're gonna implement strategy, you have to worry about culture at the same time, for sure.
Well said. And Michael, how would you define organizational culture, and what is its significance in the workplace?
Yeah, so for me, organizational culture, the best way to describe it is around practices and behaviors. So that's really what constitutes what people perceive about culture in an organization, and it's the practices and behaviors that reflect the sort of the core values and beliefs of an organization. So that's where that core content, that core DNA comes through, is how people perceive the culture, and then how culture influences performance in the marketplace.
And what would you say are some of the elements that contribute to a positive organizational culture?
Yeah, so the first project I work on in culture, I hate to say, was in the 1980s, and we weren't sure, back then. But again, a lot of great research, particularly by a gentleman named Dan Dennison out of the University of Michigan in the late 90s, really put a stake in the ground on what components of culture are critical. And there's really four general areas. The first one has to do around mission. Strategy, vision, mission, strategy, objectives. The second has to do with consistency, in terms of execution, decision-making, coordination, core values. The third piece is often what people think about when they consider culture, and that's involvement. How you work in teams, how you develop your people, how you empower them to do what needs to be done. And the fourth, that's actually one of the more critical things that came out of Dan's research, was adaptability. And that's paying attention to the marketplace, learning from the marketplace, and being able to change effectively. So those four components: mission, consistency, adaptability, and involvement.
Great response. Thank you. The next question is that how does culture shape our beliefs and values in the organization?
Well, as we say in the United States, it's sort of a chicken or egg kind of thing. Actually, culture is a reflection typically of values and beliefs. So, an organization has a culture, whether you like it or not. So you'll hear me use the term intentional, being intentional about your culture and developing culture. You need to be intentional about what kind of values and beliefs that's reflecting. So often we start talking about, all right, what is the core sort of DNA of your organization? What do you believe, particularly in terms of the approach you want to take in the marketplace? Then you can say, well, how should our culture reflect that? So I think that's, with that definition, culture being a reflection of values and beliefs, I like to view it in that direction.
And what, in your opinion, are some of the challenges organizations face when trying to establish or change their culture?
Well, first of all, is getting an understanding of what culture is.
Correct.
It's like if you ask somebody what leadership is, you have asked 20 leaders, you get 20 different definitions. Same thing, culture. So using a good research-based, evidence-based approach to understanding your culture, and not just say, well, this is have to go by what the CEO says. So let's all get on the same page about what culture is, then let's assess our culture, and then we can understand, where we can sustain or develop things that we can work on that will make a difference, in the marketplace.
Very interesting. And since you spoke leadership, and I somehow missed talking about your book, which is behind you, but we will talk about it after my questions to you on culture.
Sure.
But what role does leadership play in shaping and sustaining culture, and where does accountability lie?
Yeah, the leadership plays a key component in culture. So when we look at what influences perceptions of culture in an organization, it's behaviors and practices, but particularly the behaviors of leaders. So if we often find that one of the first places you have to start if you want to move your culture, is you have to find the sort of culture poison pills, leaders who do not reflect the values and beliefs of the organization. But then also work on developing leaders from day one, being very intentional about building a pipeline of leaders that reflect that build and exhibit the behaviors that are critical to establishing the culture you're with. So yes, leaders play a key role in it, and the accountability is almost with every leader. Oftentimes people say, well, it's the human resource department. Well, they can maybe be facilitators here, but it's executive leadership on down ought to take a very key and intentional role in. There's that intentional word again, key and intentional role in developing and understanding culture.
Well said. But you're so right. I've been culture, the accountability rests with every individual. But I have often also heard this, that in legacy organizations or old organizations, I hear a lot of young people say, this is how it happens here.
Yes.
And I've often said, why don't you go and change it? What are your thoughts?
Exactly. And that's why, you just can't let culture evolve, or just let it happen.
Correct.
Because it's amazing how stories can influence, particularly founder stories, think about the things people said about Steve Jobs and the impact on Apple or other folks. So yeah, it just can't be the way it is around here. You need to listen to that, because if people perceive that and it's different than what you want to do in terms of the business and strategy you've got, then you need to address it. But yeah, you need to be intentional, focus on the understand culture and be able to and make it the way you want it around here, and not just let it be. If that's an understanding way to say it.
Absolutely. The other question that I have is that how can organizations overcome resistance to cultural change? Because most of us like status quo ante. Yes.
Oh yeah, and that's the easy way out. Just let go things. But I think the what we're finding, and there's a lot of this is based on some good neuroscience research lately. How do you go about changing these brains of ours, and then the brains of the organization then too. It has to do with being very clear first about priorities. So let's all agree on what's important here. So that's where some of the strategy comes into culture change. And then, of course, it's okay, then based on those priorities, what practices and behaviors do we need to really start reinforcing so people can see that, visually understand it, see it happening every day. And then you need systems to support that. So that often comes in with, objective setting or how you hire people, how you recruit people, how you develop people. Those kinds of systems take a little bit longer, but if you can agree on priorities and then get the habits right, you can overcome the resistance. Plus, you got to be very clear about why. And that's, again, back to strategy. Why are we here? Why do we do what we do? And then I think that can set a great foundation.
Correct. Well said. My next question is that, the world now, everyone's talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
What strategies can organization employ to promote diversity and inclusion within their culture?
Yeah, and that's the other place where there's been a lot more great research lately. Again, you'll hear that I'm very evidence-based. I like to do what we know will work and not what the last best book said about it. But the components of culture that drive engagement for everybody. So if you build the culture that people see a vision, they can see what's going on. They understand why. They can see their role in the vision. They feel like they're involved and have empowered to do what they need to do. And they see a set of core values reflected by leaders. All those are components of culture. There's the same thing that drive people's perception of, am I included? Diversity is sort of the numbers thing, but equity and inclusion are the culture things. So to really, that foundation not only will have it a benefit for DEI initiatives, but it'll also be a big driver for attracting and retaining any talent.
Very interesting. And yet, Michael, there are so many companies which are now working in multiple countries.
Yes.
And each of these countries, have their own set of cultures. We all are brought up differently, whether in our families or in our societies or in our religions or whatever.
Right.
How can organization manage cultural differences and, try and funnel them into one organizational culture when you look at global organizations?
Yeah. So we do. Yeah, of course, different culture or country cultures are very different. But we find, and now again, because some of the research, mostly again by Dan Dennison, we have culture data globally. Over 10,000 organizations globally. And the factors of culture that drive performance, no matter where you are in the world, are the same. So but the influences of country culture, sorry for that, mean you have to focus on different things. Sure. So that's the other nice thing I've seen about the evidence is, it's not so complex, but you do have to factor in different things based on your business and based on where you're located. Right. But leaders can still focus on the same set of core cultural values, organizational cultural values, and it can help.
And do you see any emerging trends when it comes to culture because of the onset of technology, which is changing organizations dramatically?
Yes. And we saw this, we did a lot of research through COVID globally. And the interesting thing was that organizations who already had clear and aligned cultures going into any challenge did much better, were much more resilient. In fact, they not only bounced back, they bounced forward. They actually took a bad situation and figured out how to do it better. Well, technology, remote work, the way that's changing, having a resilient culture before you get to whatever the challenge is very important. So regularly understanding your culture, seeing where it's going, seeing what the impact of different economic and political and social changes, being very aware of that and staying on top of it is critical.
The other aspect of culture that I wanted to get your perspective on is the change in the way we are working now. There's hybrid working, work from home, remote working. How do leaders or HR leaders manage culture when people are working all over the place?
Yes. Yeah. So I use the term culture carriers. So there are leaders who always play a critical role. I have one client, it's a family-owned business, been very successful, grew through the pandemic. And the family members plus other leaders are always evident to folks. You hear from them all the time. They get out. They make a very intentional effort to express culture and to be out there. So it is tougher. We found that remote work, initially there was an increase in productivity. But things started to decline. And that was because it was you're in group. The people you work with every day got productive. We really leaned into being remote. Then we got a new member, and objectives changed, and things fell apart. But work between teams really suffered. So when we talk about hybrid work, we say when you're coming to work, when you come into an office, you have to be very specific about what you're doing there, and that's where culture gets spread. And so it is a different way, but it's the same kind of thing: behaviors and practices that reflect the values and beliefs. Being at that, no matter where people are, is very important.
Correct. My next question is that how can organizations embed their culture into their recruitment and selection processes?
Yeah, so as I said, culture is behavior. And so, we often get hung up on things like personality, overwrought in that area.
Yeah.
But if you focus on behaviors, which are competencies, there are knowledge, skill, and abilities that people reflect in the work they do. If you clearly identify the competencies that drive the culture factors that you would like to see, drive the behaviors you'd like to see, you select on those factors, you promote on those factors, and you develop those factors, from day one. And, we'll find out that those competencies are quite fungible, which also means it builds a lot of agility. So that kind of work that helps people, organizations be resilient. Because as things change, you've got agile people. They have the competencies that are needed to drive your culture, and it builds a very strong foundation.
And for my viewers and listeners, can you share some examples of companies with exceptional work cultures and what would set them apart?
Yeah, so the organization I mentioned before, in this area, northeastern United States, we have a convenience store gas station called Sheetz. And it was founded many, many years ago by a Sheetz family member, still run by the Sheetz family, growing rapidly. They're probably headed towards 30, 40,000 employees in 1,000 locations. But when we assess their culture, they set a global benchmark. They are in the 90th and above percentile, and it's okay for me to speak this publicly because they express it.
Yeah.
But in their brand, in their employment brand, and in the development of their leaders and how they select and reflect the core, they call it the Sheetz DNA, the DNA that always drives us. You see it everywhere. But it's very cool how that reflects in their brand in the marketplace. So, called the brand called you. Their branding, they even have it on their fuel trucks. That are out in the marketplace, in their delivery trucks. You can see their brand reflected in that. And I think that's, to me, and as they approached the pandemic and some other business challenges, their culture was so resilient. The CEO talked about, I'm glad we invested in our culture bank over the years because we had to make some withdrawals, as we went into COVID and other things, but they grew. Wow. And continue to grow dramatically. So and so you can see the direct relationship between their culture and adaptability, revenue, engagement, and customer focus, which are the key outcomes from great culture.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing this great example. So one more question related to culture, then I want to move to your book. What are some ways in which culture can promote understanding and tolerance, something that the world needs a lot of now among different groups of people?
A fantastic question, because I try to think about that. What I have learned about organization culture. I see it, falling apart in our political system. Leaders are not reflecting behaviors that reflect our core values in many countries. So I think that if you understand culture and see how that plays out within your own business, at least make a difference there, because a clear and aligned culture is not only a resilient and agile culture, but it's also it's a very tolerant culture. It accepts differences of all kinds, but actually maybe even leverages those opinions and those differences in terms of how we learn and grow as a business. So sound a little prophetic there, I would say, but I do see there's a lot we can learn from organizations and what organizations do to help some of our social ills. I don't have great confidence in it, but I'll keep preaching it. So.
Well said. So I want to now move to your book.
Yes.
It's a book on leadership, but I can't read the exact title. So could you read it to me, please?
Yes, called Strategy Driven Leadership. So
Strategy Driven Leadership.
The playbook for developing your next generation of leaders. My colleague Richard Citron, who you've had on your program, we've both had a sort of a differing careers around leadership, and we kept comparing notes, and we said, well, let's write a book on what we've learned that works about leadership, and our point is that it all starts from strategy, it all starts from culture, and then surprising, we call the whole approach is intentional leadership development, and it's really based on a lot of new research, particularly around neuroscience. How we as leaders develop new skills, how we can sustain and grow, and what skills are critical. So it's very much a playbook, a handbook, and it's sort of we used it to try to summarize the great evidence that we know now about how to build successful leaders.
Very interesting. I don't think I will do justice to your book in a few minutes, but maybe I'll schedule another conversation with you around leadership.
Be glad to.
I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Mr. Michael Couch's book on leadership on Amazon. I will go and check it myself. And good luck, Michael, with the book. So my last question to you now, Michael, and this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation. A lot of them are startup entrepreneurs. A lot of them are aspiring startup entrepreneurs. And I'll come back to culture. What would you say are 3 lessons that you think startup entrepreneurs need to remember when building culture in a startup?
First of all, it's to formally and regularly assess and understand your culture. Don't just let it happen. Don't come up with your own idea about what you think your culture is. Use the evidence, and there are great measures out there, so you can reliably and validly measure culture. And then you have to be intentional about identifying those things in your culture that drive strategy, but then also look for the things that might be barriers and thinking about how you can sustain the positives and now start addressing those that might be a barrier to a strategy. And then the third thing, of course, from my perspective, leadership and leadership development is critical. The experiences that entrepreneurs go through in starting and growing a business is the best leadership development in the world. But you have to stop at times and reflect, what did I just learn? What worked, what didn't, what am I going to do differently next time? That's what we've learned from neuroscience, how we change our brains by being reflective and listening to feedback and growing and changing, not trying to do the same thing over and over if it doesn't work.
Very interesting. And on that note, Michael, and your 3 lessons: assess and understand your culture for startup entrepreneurs, be intentional, and third, you said, was leadership is critical. Keep on investing in it. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey, about organizational culture. There's so many different aspects of culture that we discussed and talked about today. Thank you for some great responses. Thank you also for speaking to me about your book on leadership. As I said, I don't think I did justice by asking you just one question, but I'm sure someday I will ask you to do a full conversation on leadership. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ash. I really appreciate your effort to give back. I think that's very important, and I love the content on The Brand Called You.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to The Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.